Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my standard review of the new Viltrox 85mm F1.8 STM lens. In this case, it is for Canon RF, which of course is significant because we have seen so few third-party autofocusing lenses on the Canon RF mount, Nikon Z, which I believe it's also come available for as well. So that is significant, and one thing that may help this to succeed on these platforms, obviously neither of them have been very open to third-party development at this point, but the fact that Viltrox employs a USB port, in this case a USB-C, on the actual mount. It's a brass mount, but has a USB-C port built right into it that allows you to do firmware updates right to the lens. And so that does help Viltrox to be able to future-proof the lens and to make sure that it's going to continue to be compatible with your camera when the camera gets firmware updates, or in some cases as you upgrade to a new camera and protocols change as a part of that. So I think that may help this lens to be viable, even though it may not necessarily be welcomed by either Canon or Nikon. I'm actually filming on it on the Canon EOS R5 right now, so you get a sense of the quality of the footage. I'm filming at f2 and in 4K, obviously, and so you can get a sense of how it does both in tracking my face consistently and then also in the quality of the footage. So let's talk a little bit about the build. This is a familiar lens to me. This is actually the fourth iteration of this lens, starting with a manual focus version back years ago that I reviewed, and then their first autofocus version, then they had a Mark II of that. I tested all three of those on Sony FE. I'm giving it a fresh review here though because of what I've just mentioned about third-party lenses on these systems, and also of course to see how it performs on a completely different kind of system like Canon. And so as far as our overall size and weight, this is the least expensive 85mm lens, autofocusing lens that is available for Canon RF right now. It'll set you back about $400 US. So at least $200 cheaper than any other option. And it is also the lightest of any of the 85mm lenses available right now on Canon RF. 484 grams, so just right over a pound of weight. And so that makes it lighter than, say, the Samyang AF 85mm f1.4, which is nearly 600 grams. Even the Canon 85mm f2 macro lens, even though it has a smaller maximum aperture and is actually physically a little bit smaller, it weighs more at 500 grams. Part of that may be because it actually extends out while focusing, while this is an internally focusing lens. And then, of course, the big and the heavy one of the bunch, the heavyweight both in price and also in size, is the Canon RF 85mm f1.2, which is nearly 1,200 grams. So in this case, you get it's about 2.5 times lighter than what that lens is. Its dimensions are 80 millimeters in diameter, leaving you a 72 millimeter front filter thread, 92 millimeters in length. So a moderate size lens, and the dimensions I actually think make it of the mount here, which is a little wider in diameter than what it is on Sony. It actually makes this lens, I think, the most attractive version of it that I've seen thus far. It's all in metal, has a nice, glossy looking exterior, a wide focus ring that is ribbed, also in metal, very well damped, had good quality of manual focus there, mostly linear it seems like. And a new thing that we haven't seen previously is there is an AF/MF switch on the side of the barrel, which is obviously very, very welcome always to me, because that's the most logical way to control that feature. We have 9, and Viltrox calls them rounded aperture blades, but as you can see from this series, while the geometry is pretty good at f1.8, by f2.8 even, you can already start to see some of the shape of the aperture blades, and by f4, they're even more prominent. And so it's not as rounded as what I've seen in other applications. There are 10 elements in 7 groups in this design, so a relatively simple optical design, and we'll get to the optics in just a moment. You also can focus a little bit closer than in most of these cases, with the exception of the lens that is labeled macro, which allows you to get much closer. But you can focus down to 80 centimeters. Most of these others are either 85 or 90 centimeters, so you get a little bit better magnification of 0.13 times. It's not great, but I will say there's a fairly flat plane of focus, and the image quality is quite good at minimum focus distance, so that does help out as well. The only negative that I'll point to in the build segment is when it comes to the lens hood. It's a pedal-shaped hood. It is plastic, and so it feels a little chintzy compared to the rest of the lens. But more importantly, it really doesn't bayonet on very precisely. It just never feels like it quite connects well or clicks, authoritatively into place, and it takes too much force to release it as well. And so it's my one complaint that I have. Otherwise, though, this is a fairly attractive package, so there isn't anything advanced like weather sealing here. Autofocus comes from an STM or stepping motor, and stepping motors, in my experience, have a broad range of performance. Some of them are super quiet and fast, others are louder and very obviously step. This one is somewhere in the middle in that autofocus is quite quiet, though if you listen closely in a quiet environment, you can hear a little clicking and whirring as it does its thing. Not enough, I think, to be picked up much on a microphone, at least when I did my focus pull test. And as you can see here, focus pulls were fairly good, though there is a little bit of a visible stepping in there on occasion, and I did see an occasional pulse where it kind of went the wrong direction for a moment before going back the opposite direction. You'll also note some focus breathing there. When I approached the camera to see how it tracked my face in movement, it did a fairly good job. Probably the most obvious deficiency is when I started to back away quickly from the camera. It wasn't entirely smooth in keeping my eye and face in focus. But I will say that for stills, it did a very good job for my portrait series that I did with the lens. And by the way, this is a great budget portrait option. IEF was flawless. It detected the eye at all the distances that I shot portraits, and everything that I looked through was perfectly focused. Very good job. Also, as you can see from these shots with animal IAF of Loki, they are exceptionally well focused right where you want it on the iris. And so the detail there is really, really fantastic. And so all of that was good. I did note in my definitive review, my long format review, that part of the segment that I actually filmed with the camera, part of that, it didn't focus on my face initially. Somewhere about midpoint, it decided, oh, there's a face here, and it shifted focus towards my face. It was front focused for a while. I don't know exactly why that is. I will say, however, I have seen that on a few other lenses on my Canon EOS R5 and including some Canon lenses. And so, it may be a bit of a quirk between the focus system and the camera itself. However, something to be aware of, but I suspect that it's doing a fine job for this segment. And if it proves otherwise, then you'll know what the problem is as we're talking about here. In general, though, I would say this is a better than average and certainly a better application of STM than what we saw in the Canon RF 85mm f2 macro lens, which I was quite disappointed in autofocus with that particular lens. So when it comes to the image quality, this lens, I think, is much better than average. It does have a little bit of all the basic flaws, and so there is about a bit of pincushion distortion, about a -5 to correct for it. It does have also some fairly heavy vignette. I had to use about a +64 to correct for it wide open. Now I will note a little bit of a quirk there, and that is that my camera and then thus Lightroom identifies the lens as being the Canon EF 85mm f1.8. So ironically, you do get a bit of in-camera correction, though you typically wouldn't. Though it does correct some of the vignette. It doesn't correct all of the pincushion distortion. It does improve things a bit as far as vignette goes, maybe enough for you to be satisfied with. But anyway, just something that I observed as a quirk along the way. There is also a little bit of longitudinal and lateral chromatic aberrations, though I didn't find either to be extreme. And for real-world shooting, there was only a couple of images where I even noticed it if I wasn't purposely going out to look for it. The lateral CA, really not a big deal at all, and by default, it's going to be corrected either in camera because of that profile thing that I noted, and also if you pull it into Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, I had to actually undo the chromatic aberration correction to even see any of the lateral chromatic aberration that you saw in this shot here. So without that, not a problem. In terms of our sharpness profile, it is very sharp in the center of the frame and in the mid frame with weaker corner performance when it comes to contrast and acuity. You will find that as you stop down to f2, only a very minimal contrast increase, a more obvious one at f2.8, though the corners don't get really sharp until between f4 and f5.6. So if you're going to shoot landscapes, be sure to shoot at f5.6 and f8, where you will get crisp results all across the frame. And by that point, the lens is resolving at a very high level, giving you lots of detail. But even at wider apertures, say this landscape shot at f2, obviously not everything is in focus, but I didn't want everything to be in focus. And so sometimes you need to use aperture creatively to really kind of create a mood, which I love this shot for that very reason. The bokeh quality is actually quite good, I think, from the lens. And even though it's only f1.8, it can produce nice creamy backgrounds. And I really never saw anything objectionable, nor have I seen that in my previous reviews of other similar lenses, 85mm f1.8 lenses from Viltrox. So this seems to be something that they do fairly well. There is the one weakness here that I did observe, probably the biggest optical flaw, is that in certain situations it can be flare prone. If you have really intense sun in the frame or intense light just at the right angle, it will produce some pretty obvious ghosting blobs and some veiling. It's a little bit better when you stop it down, but something to watch out for, you need to be careful about. So at the end of the day, however, this is a lens that can produce some really good looking images and on a tight budget. And I think that that's why it's going to be welcome. There are a lot of people that are, porting over to Canon's RF mount cameras. And so they're spending a lot of money typically on the camera, and then they're finding that lenses are sometimes almost exorbitantly expensive. So it's going to be a nice, if you want you occasionally shoot 85mm, maybe occasionally shoot portraits, and you don't want to break the bank to acquire one, this is obviously going to be the cheapest and I think a very strong option at around $400 US. And unlike some other brands, as I looked across different places around the world, I didn't find that the lens was really inflated in any market. I think it's going to be fairly reasonable wherever you are around the world. So obviously that's going to be an attractive alternative. If you want more information, you can check out in the description down below to my text review. There's also an image gallery if you want to look at more photos. Also, you can look at my definitive long format review if you want a deeper dive into image quality and autofocus performance, all of those other things. You look in the description, you can also find linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media or to check out our new channel, Let the Light In TV, tech and video. So check that out as well. There's also linkage there to purchase merchandise, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.